Uh, it's time for the World Politics Show, and of course, we'll be discussing a number of political issues, including the fact that there is another debate that is going to come up actually on the 6th. So that should be on tomorrow and all along those lines. And I understand that there are four candidates that'll be in the debate. So we have actually narrowed it down, even though Mr. Trump will not be one of them. But I do believe that it'll be Vivek Ramaswamy, DeSantis, as well as Nikki Haley and Christie. So apparently, those are the four that will be on the stage this time around, and all along those lines. I did learn that my younger brother, has a new nickname for Mr. Ramaswamy. He calls him Beatbox Ramaswamy. So that is his nickname for Vivek Ramaswamy and some of the things that he says, and all along those lines. So it'll be interesting to see what people think. Think that Nick said earlier that he's heard some speculation about Nikki Haley maybe even having a road to victory in the Republican side and all along that kind of way, even though right now it does seem like Trump is the front runner and definitely the majority front runner in having a major lead and all along those lines. So it'll be interesting to see whether Nick does think that either Vivek Ramaswamy or Nikki Haley or anybody else has a shot, or if it's going to be that battle that we expect it to be between Biden and Trump. And if that is the case, whether it might be a Trump re-election from the last president, because he was the president before, or whether it's the current president being reelected. So it could be a possibility that we have a re-election of either one that skipped a term or one that is going back to back and all along those spaces. So it'll be interesting to see what people's thoughts around that is and everything. And of course, a number of these issues are being impacted by what is going on in the world, whether that is the situation in Guyana with Guyana and definitely Venezuela, or whether that's what's going on between Israel and Hamas, or whether that's what's going on between Ukraine and Russia, and definitely the viewpoints of the current president has, as well as the viewpoints of some of the past presidents, might be some of the issues that people will be thinking about as they are going to the polls and all along those lines. Or as many people have said, even here on this show, people might be thinking about their economic issues and whether they are making enough money to even uh, have enough money in their pockets in order to even care about who is the president. Because we do know a lot of times people are more concerned about the president than the local politicians, even though sometimes the local politicians and the state politicians are the ones that have a greater deal of impact and all along those lines. And as I mentioned earlier, and we'll get to some of the other issues, and I'm sure that both Sasha and Nick will have some interesting thoughts about a number of these kind of conversation points, including this lovely debate that'll be taking place, I believe, at the University of Alabama, if memory is serving me correctly, and all along those lines. But apparently, Kamala Harris has broken a nearly 200-year-old record for Senate tiebreak votes, and some people are even pointing out the fact that it was previously held by a slave owner. So apparently, this is something that maybe is a benefit to what is going on, or maybe it's just the nature of the divided world that we live in, that they had to have this amount of people to have this amount of vote tie breaks and all along those lines. So I'm gonna bring in I see that Lee Newton Rhodes is here. We'll see if he gets on camera, and also Nick Palveda is here. So I'll bring in Nick Palveda, one of the founders, along with Kim Calhoun of the network, along with Sasha Starr, and all along those lines. Hey, are we just basically stuck heading to a confrontation between Biden and Trump, or is there like a road to victory? Because you mentioned it earlier on World Edition, and I definitely want to hear more about this idea of there being a road to victory for Nikki Haley, because I'm thinking that it's not possible and it's going to be a Trump versus Biden rematch, whether that's what we want or don't want, and all along those lines. But you brought it up, Nick. Nick. So definitely, any thoughts around how she could even get into the election and win or be the nominee from the Republican side?
But she's got to win the Republicans over first. If she doesn't win the Republicans, she'll never become president. Right now, she's losing. Mm. But head to head, she'll beat Biden if she gets in. As a matter of fact, even Mark Cuban beats Trump, by the way. On our poll right now, Mark Cuban, if he would throw his hat in the ring, 65%, Mark Cuban, 35% to Donald Trump. So it's almost like anybody can beat Donald Trump except Joe Biden. Like seriously. But unfortunately, we have the situation where Trump has a stranglehold over the Republican Party, and that makes it really tough for the other candidates. Ramaswamy, who I don't think much of, Christie, who I think's okay, Haley's probably their best choice, and DeSantis, who I don't think very much. So you have these four candidates; they're duking it out. We'll have to see tomorrow who wins the Duke, but it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, you have the big 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the Donald Trump, and he's not even going to bother to show up because he wins. In other words, he goes, "Why should I bother? I'm going to win anyway."
Yeah,
That's
why
where we're
bother
at.
showing up? He says he's going to win. Just out of curiosity, and then definitely want to hear Sasha talks about this American race and all of those lines. But what is it about DeSantis? You spent some time in Florida. Is the reason that you are not a big fan of DeSantis? And I do have a guest that I had invited to come in, and hopefully they'll be coming in shortly. That being Robert Riggs, who has some thoughts around politics as well. But definitely, what is the reason that you think that DeSantis is not a good candidate?
Why do I
Yeah.
think DeSantis is not a good candidate? It's because of his policies and his absurd positions. He's not a, he'd be great on TV because he's radical. In other words, he throws out all sorts of crazy ideas. But, and he politically, you have to be a little bit more smooth. Instead, he's adopting the bully tactics that who did. He's trying to be a mini Donald Trump, and I think Americans are getting tired of that. So I don't see. I mean, he picks a fight with the House of Mouse. Why would he bother to pick a fight with Disney World? I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. So he's not a level-headed person, and so I honestly I don't think him. I'm not sure if he would even beat Biden. He's not your best candidate. When you look at your best candidate, my look at the best candidates actually Nikki Haley number one, number two would be Christie, number three would be DeSantis, and Ramaswamy number 17. Even though there's only four in the race, I don't think much of Ramaswamy, but that's where I sit at. What are your thoughts from Canada, Sasha, about this race coming up?
I'll tell you these days, something much more important than this is a debate tomorrow is happening. It's a decision by the US Congress and Senate about help to Israel, Ukraine, and a couple of other items. Now, right now, is decision being made and a lot of horse trading is going on. But I would like to tell you one thing. If the help to Ukraine is not going to materialize, it does not matter who will win presidential election next November, because the United States will no longer be a world power, and its opinion will be could be thrown in toilet, and it indeed has to retreat all the way back to defend against Canada and Mexico, and that's it, done, deals. So no more world power, no more longer the Asia, the Europe, the Israel, the East, the West, and so on. Go back to Mississippi River over here, and California over there, and New York over here, and Chicago over there, and just stay there. That's what's going to happen if the United States will go in disarray and in disrespect on a world stage, in case if they will, after saying that, oh, we are going to stay with Ukraine as long as it takes, and this and that, and after all that, go to the toilet, and that's the end of story.
Yeah, but Sasha, here's the arguments about not sending money over to Ukraine and Israel. The U.S. is $34 trillion in debt. Okay, why should we finance their wars? In other words, why is tell me why we should finance their wars.
Okay. First of all, technically speaking, U.S. is so should I put it very accurately? It's a financially dissolved country. I mean, it cannot get out of the hole of $34 trillion. Forget about all unfunded liabilities or so on. That's a different story. But even with the 34 trillion in debts, there is no plan. There is no even the visionaries, financial wizards who will try to explain how US can get out of the hole in the next 150 years. It's just not going to happen. Furthermore, if you're not going to help Ukraine and Israel and you're retreat all over from the world stage, you're becoming secondary, not even secondary, a third-rate power, and BRICS will install their gold-based currency and US dollars. They will go to toilet. So there is not even physical way to take care of $34 trillion. This is why I said on one of the programs, if you remember, Nick, to default on 31. Forget about your constitution. Your constitution is as good as US can continue to repay this 34 trillion goals, at least interest only, but with the high interest rates, even that is becoming questionable issue. So the easiest way, okay, you don't want to break your constitution, change your constitution. Take that out of the constitution and just default. Okay, so you will become third-rated power, but you will become third-rated power anyway, and in a much more horrible circumstances when BRICS will create this currency and they will start trading, and nobody in the world in his right mind will accept US dollar, which is not backed by anything except $34 trillion debt. So this situation is much more serious than anyone can even think about.
Yeah, just to update the viewers who aren't familiar with BRICS, because unfortunately it's not brought up on major networks. BRICS is actually an alliance between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa to create a currency so that the dollar is not used internationally to settle debts, and the dollar becomes second rate to their currency. So their whole objective is actually to undermine, yes, undermine the US dollar. Unfortunately, our major media, and it's a true thing. I mean, I'm sitting there when David Walker brought this up, I was going, you got to be kidding me. How come I have to listen to David Walker to find out about this? For whatever reason, Sasha, our major media hides BRICS. So what they do is say, goodbye, we don't want to talk about that. And they don't want to talk about the 34 trillion in debt, which you can see already is hampering the ability to make moves on the chessboard, such as something so simple as what we're saying right now. Now, we do go over the budget on the David Walker show, and it's riddled with fat. I'm not going to say it's fraud. I don't think there's fraud, but there's definitely waste all throughout the budget. And we need to settle that score first.
Hey, Nick, you're mentioning waste and everything across the budget, and I hear what you're saying. And I have brought with us a investigative journalist, Mr. Robert Riggs, who is actually, and Kim will love this. Hopefully, he'll be joining us and will come on the screen and all along those lines. But he is a Peabody Award-winning and veteran correspondent, and he has definitely done some in-depth reporting and all along those lines. He is actually also a person that has been involved in a number of documentaries, including one called Free to Kill, which is a 5-part television documentary which premiered on Fox Nation, streaming in March of 2022. And he's been involved in a number of other things as well. So he's definitely one that might agree with you around this notion of law enforcement and domestic and international terrorism, because that is part of the things that he talks about and all along those lines. So, Mr. Riggs, glad that you were able to join us. And if you want to jump into the conversation, always glad to have amazing guests with amazing backgrounds and all in that space. So hopefully you're hearing us and you can share a little bit about what you've got going on and your thoughts around some of the things that are taking place, even around the international and other thoughts that are going on. So, Mr. Riggs, definitely if you get off mute, but definitely glad to have you here.
He's a serious podcaster. He's got that big mic, Mark, but he's got to get off mute. You're right now muted. I don't think I can unmute him. I can't. You've muted yourself.
There he goes. Hey, how you doing, Mr. Riggs?
There we go. The floor is yours.
I picked a bad time to install a new piece of equipment here.
I understand that, Counselor. Okay. Floor is yours, Counselor.
Yes, if you just share a little bit about what you got going on, because I know that as an investigative reporter, you talked about a number of these things, including things that we were then talking about today and everything. So you've definitely done a lot, even in law enforcement and investigative reporting. You've even talked about some of the corruption that goes on in our political lanes. And like I said, I don't know your own political lanes, whether you are Republican or Democrat, or even you just are upset at corruption in general. But I'd love to hear your story as you would like to present it and some of the things that you are involved in.
Well, for full disclosure, back in the day, this is a long time ago, I worked for Democrats, and
You just went on mute. I don't know what happened to your mic.
That's called new equipment.
Do not hear you at all now. So, Kim, if you want to jump in while we try to get Robert's stuff going on, and I think Adam was. You actually said Adam will not be joining us because he's not.
Well, I'm going to see if I can edit his mic.
You're going to edit his mic,
right? I'm going to try to edit his mic. I think it's the same problem Nick had the other day.
Gotcha.
My mic works fine today.
I can access a portion of it from here.
Okay. Well,
yeah, yours is working fine.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to exit out.
You might have to exit out, Mr. Riggs, and then exit back in.
We can't hear you.
Because we're not hearing you at all. So you might have to exit out and then exit back in.
See, maybe you pulled the plug.
Yeah. You want to just exit out.
It's true crime.
Yeah. If you want to exit out and then exit back in.
I think one of our right. I think I have to agree with Nick that it doesn't benefit the United States any if we are continuously helping everyone else until we fix our own problems, because we truly cannot be real leaders of the world if we don't fix our own problems first. And our debt and GDP is just out of control. We are way out of control. We need to reel it in and fix it. And then maybe put some better leaders in office and then help the rest of the world. But right now, the people who are fighting have been at battle for years, a long time. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's like an old-fashioned feud, right? There is absolutely nothing you can do. You can go in there and mediate, and then behind your back, they're going to sit there and stick each other with little pencils or something. So, I mean, you're just not going to stop it. This is the men's way of taking care of business and in their country. This is how they do things. Have always been at war. Israel has never wanted to find a mediation with Palestine. I do believe a two-state solution would kind of temporarily fix a few problems. If you want to get rid of Hamas, sit back and wait and cherry pick them as they leave, like deer hunting, but don't go blowing up the whole forest to kill one or two people, because you're killing everybody and everything and destroying buildings and houses that people have built for, years and lived in for generations. And you just destroyed all that. So I think the two-state solution would help a little bit, but I think that those mediations can go on without our help and without our funding them. We don't need to fund the wars. We need to stop them. And that's what needs to happen. Robert, do you have your mic back?
How about this?
Yes, we hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
You were saying something about being Democrats for full disclosure and all along those lines. So if you want to share a little bit more about that, then we'd love to hear you.
Well, I worked in Congress straight out of graduating from Texas A&M, starting back in 1972. And a senior member, it was a seniority system in those days. I went to work for this Congressman Wright Patman in 1972. He'd been elected in 1929, was the most senior member of the House. It was a seniority system. And, later that system was overthrown. I'll say this in hindsight about the system now, is that they got things done. Maybe a truly democratic institution inside the House itself doesn't work. It's just the fighting. But I came back later as a correspondent. I covered the Reagan White House, George H.W. Bush White House, Capitol Hill. But I know you're talking about the budget. I covered Senator Phil Gramm of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if y'all recall, he got passed the Gramm-Rudman Act.
Right.
And, many people said it could not be done. He got it done, and we balanced the budget. But, that budget has gone out of control in large part because of wars, the war on terror. George Bush being a Republican, and bless his heart, he's here in Dallas, lives close to me. But, that's where the budget really started going crazy. And I don't, and nobody's wanted to raise taxes. And you're going to have to raise taxes somehow, do something to get out of this. So, but I think they've kind of come to feel that, we live with a debt. We're the strongest, richest nation in the country. We can live with it. I don't know when that runs out, but I was impressed that, we did it. They balanced the budget under Phil Gramm. I'd love to hear Phil Gramm on this program.
Yeah. Did you ever run into David Walker when you were in Congress? He was the former Comptroller General of the United States, David M. Walker.
I know the name. I never came across him.
Okay, because he runs a show on us every Monday for like the last 2 years, and goes over these budget issues, which I find to be fascinating. I also had a cousin who was the Attorney General of the United States, William Saxby. Did you ever run into him? He was the Attorney General under Ford and Nixon.
I do recall the name. Didn't come into contact with him.
Okay, yeah. Now, well, I recall the last time they balanced the budget was under the Clinton administration. Would that be correct?
Well, and that'd be a result of Phil Gramm, not Clinton.
Yeah, never find a dollar you can't
Yeah.
spend, and if you don't have one, just make one up.
Yeah.
But it's become a serious item, as you can see, because it's now affecting our international movements. In other words, what we're able to do, because we run to this deficit, and it's $34 trillion and growing, which isn't a good thing. And the last I heard on Social Security and Medicare, they say, don't touch Social Security, don't touch Medicare. Now, wait, who's going to pay for it? Oh, the U.S. government. The U.S. government's broke, $34 trillion in debt. And Medicare goes broke by the end of this decade, and Social Security goes broke next decade. And the major media is out to lunch on this, and Congress and Washington, D.C., none of the politicians are going to talk about, because frankly, there's no easy solution. You either raise taxes, or you decrease the benefits, or you do both, or you go to plan B, which I think is going to happen, hyperinflation, which is what we saw.
Hey, Nick, just really quickly, because one of the things that Mr. Riggs was involved in, and he's had the pleasure of doing a number of things, and I definitely want to get to some of these things, but you were definitely involved in even like looking at terrorism and all along those lines, because I know that in 2000, both the FBI and the University of Virginia Critical Incident Analysis Group handpicked you as an expert on a panel that scrutinized the architecture of terrorism, and definitely we're seeing terrorism going in this kind of way of the world with Hamas, and definitely there was terrorism around 9/11, which is part of what you were involved in and everything. So if you could just tell us a little bit about your thoughts around terrorism and the division going on in society and your role in that particular organization that you were part of.
Well, back in, I was around 1998, I was selected to be a member of a very multidisciplinary panel. There were a lot of people smarter than me. There were people from the CIA, military intelligence, the architect of the Capitol, an esteemed architectural historian, the case agent, and the principal from the Columbine shootings. It was a wide range of people to sit down in a room, get locked in a room for about 3 days to discuss what was called threats to symbols of American democracy. And the outcome of that was a report. And by the way, I was selected because the FBI had identified me as a reporter that had been at the scene at that period in time of most of the countries, what they classified as critical incidents. I was at Waco for all 51 days of the siege. I was at Oklahoma City. Was right after it happened. I was the first in the country to report it was domestic terrorism. Um, and so I was a part of that group. And basically, the report said that the Capitol was at risk. The World Trade Center towers were at risk. And unfortunately, nobody read the report. That's what bottom line, it comes down to it. It was all there. I remember a senior FBI person who was in the room, and we'd take breaks for meals, and he was saying, I'm going back to the Bureau. I'm eligible for retirement, and I'm going to retire. Why? Well, this is coming. No one's listening, and I'm not going to be here. It's not going to happen on my watch. I'm not. And sure enough, it came. So that really led me later to I was embedded for CBS, the station group, with the lead unit during the invasion of Iraq. Up until that point, I was doing terrorism reporting, a lot of bioweapons, weapons of mass destruction reporting. And so that took me into Iraq. And when I came out of Iraq, my producer and I decided we were really going to dig into terrorism. And we were the first in the country to report and maybe to even discover how Al-Qaeda was videotaping the roadside bombings and using them for recruiting. We discovered that a web hosting company in the suburbs of Dallas in Richardson, Texas, that was connected to Hamas. They had a fundraising arm here, which was, by the way, illegal, called the Holy Land Foundation. But we tracked that they were hosting all of this propaganda to recruit suicide bombers to attack U.S. soldiers, British soldiers, and the Israelis. And we trailed it all the way to a place in Birmingham, England, in the Midlands. It's a big Pakistani community. And so that really took us on a journey of investigating Hamas. And we got hidden cameras into some of the Hamas fundraising events around the country. And the bottom line of it, and it fit with their, I guess you could call it their constitution, but, they would chant, children would chant, kill the Jews, kill the Jews. It was about killing the Jews. Still is today. So I kind of reprised that report recently to bring it back to life. The Hamas members here that were involved with the Holy Land Foundation, they're in prison. They drew long prison sentences. Others were out of the country and remain unindicted. And they were related to the chief spokespeople you're seeing now that are speaking up for Hamas. They're sitting in Qatar, where they reportedly live in luxury. They haven't been in Gaza in years. So I understand the Israelis' frustration of this going on for so long. And my friends that are Jewish that I know, they feel like October 7th was the start of a new Holocaust. And then when they've seen the support for the Palestinians, which they view as support for Hamas, they really believe it's a pogrom. It's a new Holocaust in the making. And I don't think they're going to stop till they basically level the Gaza.
Well, along those same lines, I just wanted your thoughts around, because we talked on this show about the protests and a number of other things. But as a reporter, what is your thoughts around the protests? Because we've had some of the people that are feeling that the protesters don't necessarily understand the situation, and they're part of this division that goes on in America and all along those lines. But I was just wondering, as a reporter, your take on this, and whether you think that is a legitimate complaint that people have about the college students that are complaining about Palestine and wanting Palestinian freedom.
I think we live in a time of victimology. We want to celebrate the latest victim, whether it's about gender or anything else, or whether it's about body shaming. And I don't think that many of them are really schooled in history. I think that they are funded. That's my suspicion. I've saw this before when I was attacked by the supporters of Hamas doing our stories. They had well-funded organizations in this country that will accuse you of bias and discrimination. And, we were pointing out, look, the U.S. government has named this group a terrorist organization. And, and after what we were going through in the war and the roadside bombings, I just don't know that they get it. But these things seem to be very well organized to me. And I think behind that kind of organization, there's got to be money.
That makes sense. Sasha, you had a question?
Yes, Mr. X, I'm in Canada and following up a lot of international sources. And today, in order to be better prepared for this program, I saw the Israelis radio station in the Russian language, which I understand because I originally from Soviet Union, from Ukraine, actually. And first of all, speaking about what's happening today was very, very good day for Israel. They continue their attack in Gaza, and not only northern Gaza, but also southern Gaza. They're very, very careful to be focused on Hamas fighters. And although there is very little difference between Palestinians and Hamas people, because Hamas people, they have the weapons, and Palestinians, supposedly, they don't have weapons. That's the only difference, because they look alike and they mingle among themselves. And Hamas fighters who, on one of the program, Mark, actually more than one program, he insisted that they are the freedom fighters who are ready to sacrifice themselves and being killed to prove their point that Israelis are aggressors or so on. Okay, that's possible. But then why are they hiding behind the Palestinians? Why they're not going in the open and say, Israel, we are going to fight you. Let's do fight. No, they are going back to their tunnels and all these despicable places, hiding behind the Palestinians, which means they're endangering the peaceful Palestinians who have nothing to do with the Hamas. If you can believe it, I don't believe that. I don't
Sasha,
there are peaceful Palestinians. To me, that's nonsense. But if world opinion is that, I'm not there to fight world opinion. Okay, so there are peaceful Palestinians who have no means to or no thoughts of harming Israelis, although you know that a lot of Palestinians participated on October 7th. They were going through the wall. They were grabbing this 82 years old woman and taking the Holocaust survivor. They were taken over, and a lot of hostages even today, they are in the houses of the Palestinians. That's why Hamas cannot even locate it. They don't know 100% what they are. But there are several women that they could release, but they didn't. Why? Because these women would tell all the world what a horrible things they did to these women, including rape and tortures and so on. By the way, today in the United Nations, there was a delegation of Israeli women who wanted to talk about all the atrocities committed against them. But the world is busy with this Hamas business and anti-Israeli protests and so on. Only one reason for that: anti-Semitism, which is engraved in a structure of the Western world. And well, it was quiet for quite some time because it was politically incorrect, say these things. I mean, people would think that, well, you're...
Well, Sasha, to be clear and everything, to be clear and everything, and I would love to hear Mr. Riggs' opinion of this. Actually, what I said was I was reporting what I had heard the Hamas leader said, because I think that is what journalists do, and you are a journalist, Mr. Riggs, so you don't always agree with what the people say, and that is what I was saying. I never said that I agreed with what they said and everything. So hold on a second, Sasha. So I'm just wanting to hear from somebody that is in the reporter field that you sometimes report on things that are said that you don't necessarily agree with. That's my question to you, Mr. Riggs. Do you sometimes report on things that you don't necessarily agree?
Well, journalism today really doesn't even resemble what I was in years ago. I mean, now it's like everybody, you take sides, and it's, you play to the ratings on those sides. But I have to say that if Hamas was not using the people as human shields, we wouldn't be suffering these awful losses. And I do wonder about the motivations of people that so harshly criticize the Israelis for what they're doing. My God, look at what we did in Iraq. And we tried precision bombing, and it's never that precise. There's always going to be collateral damage, which means people. Look how many people we killed in Dresden. I can't, I can't.
200,000.
Yeah. So it was a fight against evil. And my sense from everything I learned about Hamas and working that it is an evil organization. And I've read some of the reports coming out of from the Israeli government of the atrocities, the savageness of what was done to women, mutilation, rape, assaults, gang rapes. Yeah, it's just it's an appalling time. I can understand why the Israeli people are so upset, and I can understand here why the Jewish people are so upset. Some of us have been asking ourselves, has there been, it seems like there's a resurge in anti-Semitism. Has it been sitting out there and we didn't see it? I live close to near a synagogue here in Dallas, one of the largest, and the pro-Palestinian demonstrators have shown up in demonstrations. They're yelling anti-Semitic chants. Plus, now it's drawn the neo-Nazis, and they're out there with enormous Nazi flags with a swastika. I'm the son of World War II veterans, my uncles, my father, grandfather, and all. Why? And God bless it, rest them, they're all gone. But I want to tell you, in their age, if you had brought a Nazi flag out, there would have been a killing. It would have been, they were so angry by what had happened to them and what they'd seen. I mean, one of my uncles had liberated one of the concentration camps, and it affected him forever.
Yeah, just really quickly and switching subject slightly, but still staying on politics, so the World Politics Show and everything. Some of your investigations also intersected with the Watergate and Pentagon bribery scandals, and we sometimes think, even in this modern day, how there is intersection of our national politics and some of the things that are going on. I've brought up on this show before that I'm not 100% convinced, even with Clinton, that Robert Brown, the Commerce Secretary, wasn't terminated or killed in all along those lines. And like I said, some people can argue that whether it was a hit or not a hit and all along those lines. But as one that has investigated these kind of scandals, is there some of these scandals that we're not hearing enough of? Because I'm even thinking that we don't know the full story around Noriega and the drug deals and all in that space. But you were involved in the kind of reporting. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around this kind of things that are going on with our political leaders, be it on the Republican side or the Democratic side.
Well, the member I worked for started the first Watergate investigation in the House Banking Committee, where he was chairman, and was the first to start investigating the source of the money for the Watergate burglars. It had come out of Mexico and was laundered through banks in Miami, and they were tracing it. And finally, and I was a gopher, a researcher on this. So, I'm a young kid out of college, but I had curiosity. And so finally, to go further, you needed subpoenas. You needed subpoena power. And in that committee, you had to have, a majority vote of the committee. And he was voted down. And interestingly, there were a group of Democrats who voted him down. Those same Democrats were later all ended up convicted in various bribery scandals years later across the country. And then on the Republican side, the Republican who led the fight to squelch the Patman Committee was Gerald Ford. I don't know that a lot of people know that, but he led it. Now later, the Senate picked up, and it was a bipartisan effort in the Senate, which we certainly never see today. And, you talk about conspiracy theories and deaths, you just have to think back. Remember, G. Gordon Liddy had that plan to put a drug powder on the steering wheel of the investigative reporter Jack Anderson, who wrote the daily column, the Washington Merry-Go-Round. And the plan was it would make him kind of go crazy driving, and he'd wreck and be killed. So it's never out of the realm of, wondering.
Yeah. Along those same lines of
you mentioned earlier about the collateral damage, and of course, assuming that the internet is correct and the study that I got from the internet was correct, people are complaining about the Palestinians that are dying, the women and children. Well, how many did the United States and our allies actually kill in terms of innocent civilians in Iraq? How about this number? 280,771 or more innocent civilians were killed during the Iraq War. Not even close to what's going on in the Palestinian. But because of the lack of social media and the lack of media in general, because the United States put a kibosh on information coming out of Iraq, it took a while to pull this study together. But if you look at what the U.S. did, what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, it even close. U.S. killed 280,000 Iraqis in terms of collateral damage in the war in Iraq, at least according to the study that I read. And it might be more. This might be the low end.
And one more thing, Iraq never committed to U.S. something what Hamas committed against Israelis on October 7th, right?
Well, right. As a matter of fact, make it worse, Sasha, what you just said. The funding, from what I understand, in other words, the problem with information is it's only what you can pull off of. The funding and the people that blew up the World Trade Center weren't even from Iraq. They were from Saudi Arabia. Okay, yet for some reason, and again, one of the reasons I've understood is that George Bush Sr. had a threatened assassination by Saddam Hussein when he was in Kuwait. And this was revenge time for George Bush Sr. Whether all this is true or not, like I said, hard to believe, but it's possible. And so what George Bush Jr., this was just revenge time for George Bush Sr., and they invaded Iraq on a pretense, and they wouldn't even touch Saudi Arabia. And that's where all the terrorists that hit the World Trade Center came from.
But remember, the story about Iraq is there is a very peculiar thing which Robert, maybe you're aware of it, that Saddam Hussein, being very proud and stubborn man, he would not allow to international inspection to come into Iraq and make sure that there is no nuclear weapons being developed or anything like that. He said, absolutely not. I will not allow anybody ever to inspect our facilities. And Russians, at that time, Primakov was second in command after Putin. And Primakov, who knew the East very well. He knew several languages, including Arabic and Farsi and many others. And he told Saddam Hussein, agree to inspection. You don't have anything. You don't have the nuclear weapons. You're not developing nuclear. What are you fighting about? Just agree. He said, no, I will never agree. Well, you know the result.
Well,
go ahead, Robert.
I knew George H.W., covered the White House. I knew him from Texas, and I knew his son, too. When he was governor, I'd covered him and knew him on a first-name basis. And in the wake of 9/11, the leaders and the leadership of the country, and I believe the nation, were driven by fear. And they thought back to the reports from the first war, and they just thought it had to be true. And it's become very clear. Mike Morrell, that later was the interim CI director, he did an episode in his podcast where he just laid it all out, all the mistakes that were made and the things that were ignored. And it really goes back on the president's shoulder that they just wanted to make it true. They just thought it has to be true. And they turned the information that way. And as a reporter, when I saw Colin Powell, who I had deep respect for, I mean, I'd known of him. Well, actually, had met him when he was a deputy national security advisor during Reagan, or was it Bush? Well, anyway, when he did that presentation to the UN, I was like, "That's it, that's it. It must be true." And I'd been doing a lot of reporting, and you thought, could be true. And but then, later when we see it wasn't there, I said to my friends, I said, when he passes away, his obit will be he was the guy that got fooled. And and the New York Times had a headline somewhere along that way. I mean, it really destroyed the legacy of his career. And the reading I've done of government reports, I mean, having reported there, I've always been interested in it. Saddam didn't want the inspectors in because he was bluffing his neighbors. He was bluffing Iran and others. He wanted them to think he had these things as a deterrent. And unfortunately, like I said, he played chicken with George Bush. And your number of the people killed, I don't doubt it. I mean, just the number of people that died in the internal conflict between the Sunnis and the help me out here, who's the other group? Shiites, Sunni and Shiites. Just the killing that has taken place between them. I think that our invasion and what we did there just set off a chain of events that are going to be troublesome in the world for, maybe another century, that contribute to many things we're seeing today, the rise of Iran and stuff. And I was with a Patriot missile battery, and it was the primary battery that was tasked to go at the front of the invasion, out in front of everybody, get into the center of the country to set up, because the rest of the forces, the 101st Airborne, could not bring their helicopters and all. They were worried about getting, quote, slimed. And as you may recall, or maybe you don't know, the war started prematurely. The war was not supposed to start for a while, and they got intelligence that Saddam was in a basement of a building, and they hit it, and he wasn't. And Saddam immediately unleashed Scuds that came in on our position. We were still in Kuwait, northern Kuwait, at staging areas, and our unit shot them down. And, we were all wearing full chemical warfare suits, the mask, everything else, expecting, well, here it goes. And lo and behold, they came in, explodes over, nothing, wasn't there. And at that moment, I thought, wow, where is it? Because in the briefings, when we arrived in country, the briefings were, and it was interesting, as an embedded reporter in that day, you had access, you signed an agreement that things you wouldn't report, but you had access to all kinds of classified information. And when my crew and I arrived in country, the battalion commander of our unit pulled us aside privately and said laid out all the intelligence about we were going to take heavy casualties from chemical weapons, biological weapons. They believed the desert had been seeded with anthrax, and said basically to us, look, guys, everything's changed since we got here. This wasn't the plan when we originally were coming. I understand if you want to back out. And of course, we were all veterans, like, no, we live for this. So, but things started happening, and you were like, ooh, they're not any, just in the beginning, when you would expect these things to be used. No chemicals. And you wore all you wore special sensor tape on your biological weapons suit and everything else, and nothing. And boy, it was at that moment I began to wonder, what's going on with intelligence? And then there was another moment. As we were headed up into the center of the country, we got ambushed, and it was in an area where they literally told us in pre-briefings that, oh, they're going to you're going to have rose-colored parades. You know, they're going to be celebrating. You got to move on. Don't get delayed and stuff. And here we are at night, hunkered down, being hit. And I turned to our medic, who had been a special forces guy that was in there in Gulf One. I said, "Well, Captain, where's the parade?" He was like, "I never believed that shit and that intelligence." You know,
Hey, just along
and
those same lines, and Robert asked, definitely Lee Newton Rhodes asked you a question. I know Sasha's got a question as well, but he was asking whether you think that journalists are permitted to report the truth on the ground in Gaza, or are they being censored? So, as one that has done some of that wartime reporting, what is your feelings about the current reporting?
I can't imagine there are any journalists from America on the ground in Gaza. Um, I mean, in Gulf War One, you knew that, you know, you were from America. Journalism, it made no difference. You were also a target. And this had happened in the first war. You know, I don't know if you remember when the CBS crew that decided to venture into Iraq on their own were taken hostage and brutalized. Um, so I can't imagine we have anybody there. And you know, in our coverage, there was an embedding agreement, and one of the big rules is that you were a non-combatant, you were not to have a weapon, and it was interesting. You know, things got going bad, and some of the captains and stuff wanted to give us M16s for our Humvee. And we declined and said, look, we've signed this deal. But my cameraman had been a combat photographer for the Marines in Gulf War One. As you know, I'd worked for later worked for a defense committee in Congress and went to military schools. We knew how to use the M16. We told them, look, if bad things happen, we'll know where to find one. But that was one of the big rules. The other big rule was that you were not to report your position. Of course, there was self-preservation involved with that. And you're not to report weapons malfunctions that might give the enemy some advantages. And there were a number of other things, but those were the three there. And not to show the faces of the dead, before, you know, because they needed to be notified. The families needed to be notified. But otherwise, it was pretty open, and I just looked at it. My reporting was just that little microcosm of the war, that unit that I was living with, and you know, what was their mood, what were they doing, what did they think, and we didn't have a bigger picture of the war. And frankly, I don't think the people sitting in anchor chairs back here really got it either.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sasha, you had a question. I think that Lee had a couple of other questions. We can go a little bit over and everything because there's not a show till about 7. Everything, but we don't have to go over too much because got to respect Robert's time as well. But definitely, Sasha, you had a question.
Yeah, Robert, I'm with a great interest listening to your story. And by the way, my late father ended up as an officer of the Soviet Army in Berlin in 1945. And he told me a lot of things about the war and how it was done. I was curious enough to find out as much as possible. Now, my home country, Ukraine, is involved now in a horrible, terrible war against Russia. And what's interesting is that, of course, Ukraine depends heavily on the US and NATO help. This goes without saying, because if it wouldn't be there to be provided right from the day one, I don't think that Ukraine would be able to fight Russia on its own. Ukraine was completely unprepared. They didn't have an army, so to speak. They didn't have weapons necessary to fight Russia. But the first, if you remember, the Biden, he advised Zelensky that he would provide him the plane to fly out of Ukraine in order to save his life. So there was very, very little belief that Ukraine can really fight with Russia. However, it did happen, and Ukraine was very successful, at least in the first year, and it proved itself that it can fight and it can attack Russians and so on. So now to proceed further and get help to start real counteroffensive against Russia and go to Crimea and so on, all of a sudden everything got stuck. The US help was too little, too late, and right now it's at great danger to be completely evaporated, stop over, period. Now, what they would mean? Okay, Ukraine will continue to fight most likely anyway, in very difficult conditions, but nevertheless. But US is risking much more than Ukraine in a way, because it will be viewed as a country that cannot keep its word for its people that it's supporting. It would become a second-rated power. It will be a great message to Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, the BRICS countries that are now creating a new gold-based currency that may in 5, maybe 10 years, it could replace US dollar. And all that is becoming a great danger to United States. It's a geopolitical, it's military, it's economic, it's just name it. There are just not enough even means how to describe it. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think I've got to confess to being something of a Cold Warrior. I worked on a defense committee in Congress during the Cold War. I had a top secret security clearance. And, as we led our happy lives, there was always a war, even proxy wars going on behind the scenes, a war with our submarines, other things. And I think I knew Tom Clancy, and I think he did a pretty good job of capturing some of that in the stuff he was doing. So personally, I felt they're our adversary. They always have been. And if you can fight your adversary without spilling American blood and American boots on the ground,
Exactly.
have at it. Do it. Also, before this really got going, I had a conversation with a former member of the Joint Chiefs that I'm friends with. We both, and he had spent some time training Ukrainian military members. And he here in the States, as a lot of that has taken place over the recent years. And he said that he thought they were the most resilient, toughest people he'd ever met. And he said, they will never quit. He said the Russians can move this into the urban areas and they will be the most horrific door-to-door fighting for a long time. The Russians will suffer even more losses. I also think it's exposed that, the bear was really kind of a sheep in many of the antiquated weapons, poor strategy, that sort of stuff. But if we stop the aid, we in one sense, it might not be immediately, might be years, but we probably have signed a death warrant for the Ukrainian people.
Well, hey, Robert, along those same lines, I've heard some of the political candidates that have talked about using our military to address issues, including the issues around migration and all along those lines. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And then I've also got another question around some of our allies as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts because definitely I think that Vivek Ramaswamy and a couple of others have talked about this, notion of us using our military to deal with some of the issues that we have, whether it be police, gang violence, or be it drugs coming across the border, or fentanyl, or a number of other things. But I'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
Well, I'm very close to this, being in Texas. I've got lots of members of the Texas Department of Public Safety, the troopers, and the Texas Rangers that are doing assignments on the border. So I hear the stories from them. And then my former producer that we did all the terrorism reporting, he is there, and he's boots on the ground. And he's an old leather shoe, chase the story. And he's already written 2 books about the situation. And uh, I think we face a huge threat from the cartels coming. I recently interviewed Ed Calderon. I don't know if y'all are familiar with him. Ed was a member of one of the elite Mexican drug interdiction groups, and he was aggressive and honest. And the administration in Mexico changed, and suddenly his bosses all changed, and he was called into an office and told, we're now working for a cartel, and you can take them. You can, and the quote was, you can take the silver or you can take the lead. He got the message. He smuggled it. He and his daughter fled that night, got themselves across the U.S. border. He's here today. He does training. One of the things Ed talks about, he predicts that we may eventually have a military confrontation there with China, that China is really getting a foothold in that country. They're the supplier of all the precursors for fentanyl, which is, poisoning this country. And it seems like it's really underreported. I mean, I'll give you an example here of how bad it's gotten. I do the True Crime Reporter podcast, so I do crime minimum. That's my whole focus. And I talk to inmates, and I've got some inmates in the federal penitentiary that talk to me. And, I heard from them, said, don't send me any mail. We're not accepting mail now because people were smuggling in the mail, in the paper, embedded with fentanyl that you could, use a liquid and bring it back to life. I mean, that's how pervasive this has gotten. And the Chinese are behind it. And then the drug habits of America have created this giant criminal organizations. The Mexican cartels are multinational. They're in Australia. They're in Russia. They're all over the country, and they're coming across. They're getting their people across. People that can't go through the other process because they've got criminal records. They're bringing them in, and they're pretty open about it. So, and we're starting to see the crime problem on this side of the border. We've had problems in Dallas of Honduran gangs that have come across, of hitting suburban neighborhoods at night with robberies, home invasions, car thefts, and they are a savage. These groups coming across they have no compunction about killing children, women, anything. It's all about I'm gonna get your stuff.
Yeah, along the same lines, I just wondering your thoughts, because you mentioned the true crime part that you do, and all along those lines about the nature of the criminal justice system here in the United States. And we've definitely had some guests that have been on the show, and even some of our regular panels that have conversations about whether it is a fair system and all along those lines. But as one that has reported to a variety of people, including some serial killers. And matter of fact, in the background, you probably hear the TV, and it's Criminal Mind, which is one of my favorite shows, and all along those lines. But I just wanted your thoughts around the criminal justice system in general.
Well, my reporting introduction to the criminal justice system was 30 years ago. I exposed a parole selling scheme in Texas. We had a corrupt parole board that was selling paroles. And we also had a politically corrupt system in which the politicians, the administration at that time, were releasing 150 inmates a day, many in the day of the night, to relieve prison overcrowding. They had never complied with a federal order by a judge to start building prisons. But for years, and I mean both parties are guilty of this, for years, everybody ran on law and order, and they passed tougher laws, but they had no place to keep them. And they began playing games in the parole and prison system of, using what they call good time. For every day that you behave in prison, we're going to take 30 days off your sentence. And the prison system really became a revolving door system. And in the midst of this, I discovered they had released 68 former death row inmates. These were inmates who, in 72, when the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty, their sentences were commuted to life, which meant that someday they would be eligible for parole. But nobody ever imagined, if you looked at their crimes, they would ever be released. But sure enough, they were, and secretly, and I discovered it. And among them was a serial killer named Kenneth Allen McDuff. And the FBI that I was working with, they would classify him as a sadistic sexual killer, the most dangerous form of serial killers, because he took great pleasure in torturing his victims, and for long, long periods of time. He got out. The day after he walked out, he started a murder spree that went on for 2.5 years, abducting women, women from car washes, women out of convenience stores. We've produced a story, a series that's on Fox Nation called Freed to Kill, that takes you through the whole story. I had gotten many more records over the years. I got every detective, investigator, prosecutor involved in this case and the victims to sit down and tell the story. And the takeaway in the story is that there's a certain part of the population and the prison population that are violent, sadistic. You're not going to rehabilitate them. Pedophile, you're not pedophile. You're not going to, the people who sexually assault children, you're not going to rehabilitate them. You've got to put these people away and protect the rest of society from it. And in the wake of my story, it became a huge scandal in the state. And Kenneth McDuff became the poster boy for change. They did the first overhaul of the criminal justice system in 25 years. They passed a new capital punishment law in which gave juries here the alternative to make it life without parole, and it meant life without parole. They're never coming out. Ann Richards was governor, and she didn't run a law and order campaign at all. She was more social, but because of the scandal, she spearheaded the largest building campaign in Texas history. We got probably the largest prison system in the world. And interestingly, within a few years, the violent crime rate just sank. It was gone. Now we've got a problem in some of our urban cities where there are liberal Democratic power base. And it's almost like they're more concerned about the rights of the accused than citizens. But what is happening, they're letting violent inmates out, inmates that have had gun charges and all. They're letting them out on bond, and even personal recognizance bond, which means, I promise to show up. And as a result, we're seeing a surge in violent crimes, stranger-on-stranger crimes around the state. And I think you're seeing in other parts. This has happened in New York. And, the state systems some have been sued because of the holding prisoners too long, and that's wrong. The federal system has certainly figured out for speedy trial. I would say some of these judges need to start working, 10-hour days, rather than 4-hour days some days. But we've got a real crime problem brewing here. A combination of that and a combination of these, liberal release policies. A few months ago, we saw one outcome of all of this. We had an inmate who was a member of a Mexican cartel, violent guy, escape. He took over a prison bus. Someone had smuggled handcuff keys onto the bus for him. He took over the bus, escaped, and he was down in the center in East Texas in the woods, and he robbed cabins, and he found guns in cabins and stuff, and now he was armed. And then he stumbled into a cabin where a grandfather with his young children was there for fishing. He tied them all up. These are little kids. little kids, tied them all up and executed them. Then he later ended up in a high-speed chase with police, and interestingly, a game warden. They were in a shootout, and it was a game warden got him.
Wow.
But it just kind of shows you the nature of the inmate we have in the system today. Today, I've got the second of a two-part interview with a veteran prison warden here in Texas, 30 years in the system. He's now the director of the Texas Prison Museum. If you're ever in Texas, I suggest you stop in. It's in Huntsville, where the center of the prison administration is located. But I got him to just go unit by unit from his career and talk about the meanest of the mean and how they operated. And it really kind of is as a lesson as to what's out there. And then today's episode is really focused on his tips for personal security.
Yeah. Speaking of personal security, and just really quickly, because you mentioned earlier, and I know that it's part of your things that you've done in research, Waco, and all along those lines. So I was just wondering, do you feel that that is a problem that exists in society the way it did in the 80s and the 90s? Some of these far-right organizations as well and everything, because as I recall, Waco, there was definitely people that wanted to be secure, to have their own gun rights, and definitely kind of tighten themselves up in their own confine and all along those lines. So I was just wondering, is that an issue that you think that America needs to be concerned about, or is it less of an issue, some of these kind of far-right organizations as well? I'm just wondering your thoughts around that.
It's there, and I think some of it was fed by January 6th, although, the takeaway there was, boy, you're going to get prosecuted. But you don't know who's, just like Waco and Timothy McVeigh, you don't know the loner or his friends that's going to use that incident as a justification of, like, I've got to go. And they would consider themselves freedom fighters, I'm sure. Yeah. But I really think the greater threat is, the street crime going on now. Mm-hmm. I think the message has been sent out there that we're weak on crime. You're not going to do time. And I've spent a lot of time I've sat across from serial killers, mass killers, rapists, child predators, bank robbers, serial bank robbers. I've seen it all in the stuff. And they know. I mean, they're smart. They know. They're cunning. They know what's going on out there. And you're seeing this escalation of property crimes, personal crimes. Here in Dallas, they were just chief was just recently, talking that the homicide rate was lower. But what they didn't talk about is the home invasions, carjackings, people being robbed as they leave ATMs, those kind of crimes. And it's that really affront people's feelings of security, really affects them. It's epidemic in the suburbs here of porch thieves stealing the Amazon. I mean, it is epidemic. So, and it just kind of, it grinds away at people's trust. And as a result, you see gun sales going up. I have people in affluent neighborhoods call me, I'm pretty high profile, about, hey, where do you think I should buy a gun? What kind of gun should you own? And I'm always like, you need to go get some training, because I know from being trained by the military and everything, and in situations, when the adrenaline is pumping, you lose your fine motor skills, and you might accidentally shoot someone else, shoot an innocent person. And I had somebody on recently. He works for Fieldcraft Survival. Fieldcraft Survival is owned by Mark Glover, who is a decorated Special Forces guy. God, I think he did 13 combat assignments during the War on Terror, and was asking him for practical advice. What do you do if you're in a store and the flash gang comes in for the robbery? By the way, he said, don't stand around taking video, get your butt out the back door. Don't go out the door they're coming in. Get out the back door. But he offered common sense advice that even if you're armed, they're breaking into your car in your front lawn, maybe you need to think over. You don't want to go out there and confront them with a gun. In Texas, you have a right to go out there and shoot them. But, do you really want that trouble that is going to come after it, So it was basically, talking about things of keep your powder dry until it's, really a life-threatening situation.
Yeah, getting ready to wind down and everything. But Robert, one of the things I was curious about, well, two things. One is, do you feel that the kind of glorification of violence has been part of the problem as well? Because I have one of the places I work is a cultural arts center. They just did a hip hop exhibit, and I know that there are a number of hip hop artists that will give you that gangster portrayal. And if you drop them off in a neighborhood that was actually gangster filled, they would not necessarily survive. And all along those lines. So I just wanted your thoughts around the portrayal and whether the portrayal, just in general, just even on TV, is sometimes overly glorifying some of these criminal elements, including some of those that you've talked to.
Well, I think it really take an expert in psychology and sociology and all, and deep studies to make a conclusion. Because my son and all of his friends, they grew up doing all those shoot 'em up military games and stuff, and they're all responsible. They're not out, doing crime. So I don't know. But I do know this. We have a problem in this country. We just set a record for mass shootings.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a problem in this country of young, alienated, and typically white young men that are, there's something complicated going on there that they're turning to doing this.
I think it's a social media, and I'm a strong believer in a mandatory military service in the United States from men from 18 years old and for 2 years at least. That would unite people. There will be no exception. It doesn't matter your financial status or your educational sense or anything like that. So everybody serves 2 years. That, of course, for 2 years, they will be completely out of all the social media garbage, and they will serve their country the best they can. And after 2 years, they are grown-up men. They're not boys anymore. They're grown-up men. And that would tremendously, in my opinion, improve the fabrics of American people. What do you think?
Oh, I certainly think it could help with discipline. In the unit I was with, there were a lot of young soldiers, and they'd been shoe store clerks and fast food and stuff, and they were just looking for more meaning in their life. They couldn't afford education and all, and so the military gave them discipline, gave them a purpose. I will say that if you go to the barracks on a base, you will see the young men and women that are in uniform. They're on those phones. They're into the social media, just like everybody else. It's just
confiscate them.
Yeah.
Penalty, 4 years to jail.
My wife teaches at a private school where there'll be times you have to put your cell phone in a bucket because of something they're doing. Oh my God! You think there's just a meltdown. You think they're going to have a mental break. They're so addicted to it, so hooked on it. And heck, we all kind of are in a sense. I mean, it's always there and handy, but what you're putting into your heads from it. That's the issue. And gosh, we could get off on TikTok.
Yeah, TikTok could be a whole nother conversation. We've actually got some shows that talk about
whole episode.
Yeah, the whole episode along those lines. Just really quickly, and then like I said, just two quick questions. But one of them that I was going to ask you is when it comes to the allies and all along those lines, and I alluded to it before you came on and everything, as one that has dealt with the military, do you feel that sometimes we allow some of our allies to get away with things because we are more concerned about their role in being allies to us? I use Nicaragua as an example. I use Philippines as an example. So there have been dictators that we've trained, and even some people would argue, and I'm not saying that they're correct, that there are some other people that are instituted some of the terrorism in the Middle East that we actually trained, and all along those lines. But I just wonder your thoughts around that, because we do seem to train even some perceived enemies because we think that they are going to be able to help us in the larger war, whether that's a large war against Russia or war against whatever the enemy is, whether it's China or whoever.
That really isn't a decision of the military. I mean, they answer to the politicians, and it's the presidential administration. All they make those foreign policy decisions. They're those ones that decide, along with Congress, input from Congress, and then the military is just they're following orders.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, because I've actually had relatives that have served in the military. What is one of the things, and this is switching the topic away from politics just briefly, but you are part of this true crime series, and definitely you've mentioned a couple of the shows that you've done, but what is some of the things that you have learned that surprised you from these interviews that you have done with inmates and serial killers? Because the interview, I'm thinking hundreds, if not thousands of them and everything. But what is something that surprised you in your conversations with these people that are definitely seen as a thorn in society, for lack of a better term, and everything? But what is something that you felt that you learned in those interviews?
I never cease to be surprised by how cunning some of them are. You know, they can find a weakness in a person, a weakness in a guard, to manipulate and get their way. And just their ingenuity. I was recently down at the Texas Prison Museum, and they have all kinds of exhibits in there. By the way, they have the what's called Old Sparky, the electric chair, where I think there were 361 men electrocuted. But they just received something from they have prison craft shops, and it's really interesting to see the crafts that come out of those places. And an inmate had donated to them. He had made a child's bicycle that worked out of Coke cans.
Wow.
The bicycle chain on the sprocket was made of pull tabs. So that's always interesting. The other thing that strikes me at time is that the unthinkable evil acts that a small percentage commit. Another aspect is that, you know, I've had a sense that many are there because they've got learning differences, certainly dysfunctional families that's landed them there. I have seen programs. I recently had the head of an entrepreneurs program. By the way, he did 20 years for murder, and he's the CEO of this group. But they run a program in the prison system that's funded by outside. It's not the prison, not taxpayers. It's all by donations. They have their own program, and you have to apply to get in this program as you approach release. You can't have been a sex offender, but you have to apply, and it's a rigorous application process and interview that you've really got to demonstrate that you're changing and you want to be a business person. And they've turned out a remarkable number of inmates who have their own businesses now that are making a lot of money.
Wow.
But again, the first thing they do is they work on their cognitive skills. I run into so many that really don't think about accountability.
Right.
That what I do is going to have a consequence, and you meet all types of people in the prison. There's some, I met inmates that are really interesting people. So it's a cross section of out here of what they call the free world in our society. Yeah. Trying to think of anything else.
Well, do you think about that? Have you ever interviewed? Because I mentioned the fact that my dad was a member of a Malcolm X school here in this area, and of course, there are a number of people that are part of that school that were supporters of the Black Panthers, and I know that they had bases in definitely California and also some in Texas as well. And there are some that have even brought up programs that they brought out, even though they had a militant aspect of what they were doing, including like maybe being some of the founders of Head Start and some of the founders of
Mhm.
food in the food programs and a number of other things. So I was just wondering your thoughts around those kind of organizations, because there have been some militants that have gone into prison time, but they might have had some programs that they helped create. And I just wondering your thoughts around that.
I'm not that familiar with their programs,
Yeah.
but I will say this. I grew up in East Texas, where as a child there were wasn't black and white, it was white and colored facilities, um, restrooms, entrances to stores, restaurants, water fountains. I remember probably I was 6, 7 years old, and a store manager caught me drinking from the colored water fountain and just went bananas and got my mother, and you know, and then my mother was alarmed, thought I was going to die of a serious disease. I mean, that was prejudice and racism. So, I grew up in that, and I saw the impact of separate schools. The schools in what they call then, excuse me, colored town. They got the leftover supplies from the white schools, and so I can understand the militancy about that in race. Um, God, I think we've come a long ways, with the election of Obama and stuff. I hope we haven't gone, I hope we're not going backwards from that. But I saw it, you know, I saw it, grew up as a child seeing it, and you're, you're, it's just kind of like it's an atmosphere around people.
Right.
There were lots of smart people and good people and church people that just thought that was just the way things were. Didn't condone violence, but they condoned the other.
Yeah, they condone the actions and everything. But just along those same lines, what about the division and everything? Because that's something we talk about on this show and a number of other shows. Is there seems to be, in my mind, and I'd love to hear your thoughts if you agree with me. There are extremists on both sides. I would argue that MAGA and the MAGA crowd might be considered the extremists on the Republican side, and then some people would argue, and I think they may have a legitimate argument, that the so-called squad is the extreme on the left side, if we want to go by that nature of politics. But I just wondered, do you feel that we have become divisive again, and how can we get past this divisive nature, not just here in the United States, but also in Canada, where Sasha is, or where Australia, where Shaquille comes in sometimes, and other parts of the world. But what are your thoughts around this divisive nature of the world?
I've never seen such polarization in American politics. My wife, by the way, she worked for the late Senator Lloyd Benson. Benson, if you remember, was the chairman of Senate Finance, chairman of Senate Intelligence, later was the vice presidential running mate for Dukakis, and then became Clinton's Treasury Secretary. A World War II veteran, was a B-24 bomber pilot. I covered him and stuff, knew him through my wife, fine man, and got along. They all got along with each other, especially in the cloakroom of the Senate. But now it's just become a blood sport. I think some of it, I saw it coming about when I was covering Congress with Newt Gingrich and company starting to take power. And one of the things is the Republicans had not been fairly treated in terms of committee assignments and stuff like that. And that's kind of started to set this movement off. You had the Tea Party come about, had great influence at the polls and the primaries, and here we are.
Yep, I agree with you on that and everything.
I don't know how we get it back. I was just in Washington D.C. during the holidays and spent time with a friend of mine. We both arrived on Capitol Hill straight out of college, just kids, and he's got one of the major lobbying firms. And half of his firm are Republican, half are Democrats, because anybody with a Democratic association in the past, they can't go talk to a Republican member. That's what it's come to. It didn't used to be that way. I've known members on both sides. I mean, I had a friend that was a Democrat, and he tried working on a bill with a Republican. Pelosi found it out and punished him for it. Just told him, you keep doing that, and I'll find an opponent in your primary. And she did eventually, and fund them. That's the kind of, it's on both sides. It's both parties.
Yeah, I actually mentioned that on an earlier news story. I think it was on World Edition, but I know that there is a very popular actor. I think he's been on a couple of medical dramas, and even I think one of the crime dramas, that being Hill Harper, and he was actually offered some money to actually switch to run against Rashida Tlaib and everything. So he actually turned that money down because I think he wants the higher position, because he was actually running for Senate, and he has continued to run for Senate. Hill Harper is, but he even mentioned in a couple of news reports that I've heard that he was offered a significant amount of money. I think it was in the neighborhood of like $250,000 or something like that, to actually run against Rashida Tlaib, but he actually chose not to do that and to run for the Senate seat instead. And like I said, some people are criticizing him for that, other people are praising him for that. But it'll be interesting that these lobbyists are actually throwing that kind of money around. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah, well, it is. It's distressing. I mean, my wife and I have looked at each other like, when you're calling each other names like this, how will you ever get a bill? How will you ever pass a bill or work together? I mean, you're always going to felt stung by it. Both sides. So, I mean, we're all human, we none of us too good with insults,
No, not at all. I agree with you on that and everything. Just really quickly, what about journalism drew you to journalism? Just really quickly, and if you want to tell people about your podcast, as we're winding down this particular show, went over a little bit longer because I had an amazing guest on and everything. But if you can tell folks what got you into journalism, and some of the ways that people can hear about your true crime podcast and some of these amazing interviews that you've alluded to.
Well, I was working in Congress on a defense committee, and we were picking up crumbs from the Watergate committee, things they couldn't investigate. It involved corruption in the Pentagon related to Watergate, stuff like that. And all the staff in that committee, they were ex-military, CIA intelligence, and they didn't want anybody to even know their name. I was the young guy that had come in. I worked for the chairman, and that gave me cachet, and I'd worked in campaigns. So I was the guy that talked to the press, and we were in the press a lot. So I was talking to CBS, the networks, Washington Post, New York Times reporters, and I really liked what they were doing. I really thought they really serve an important purpose in a democracy. And I always felt like, look, these are tax dollars being spent up here. The people have a right to know how they're getting spent, why they're getting spent that way. And that's what drew me to it. And one of the reporters who would come around was Bob Schieffer, a fellow Texan. He covered Capitol Hill, and Bob helped me get started. I mean, I just told him, hey, I want to get into this. And I'll say this, what you see, or what you saw in his reporting and saw in Face the Nation always, you saw the real Bob Schieffer. You couldn't have met a nicer person, a more caring, dedicated journalist. No games, no ambushes, that sort of thing. Just the old school, just the facts, ma'am. And so, interestingly, we came back around all these years later when I was doing the McDuff Free to Kill television series. I'm doing the research on his original crimes. And lo and behold, the byline, I'm in the archives of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. The byline is none other than Bob Schieffer.
Wow.
And I called Bob, and I went, Bob, I'm reading these things, and I'm doing this documentary. And he goes, well, wait a minute. You telling me this guy's out? I said, yeah. And so it was interesting all these years to come full circle back. But I really enjoyed doing it. But today, there's really not there's not a place for people like me. Investigative reporting has been gutted across the country. It's expensive. It's risky. The big companies, they don't want to do it. They're more aimed at, let's find, just test with surveys on all what sells. I would, in this day and age, I would never have been sent to Iraq. They wouldn't have spent the money.
Mhm.
And it's my sense that, MSNBC, they're out on the left, Fox is out on the right. They've chosen sides, and there's no longer, hey, just give me the facts. It's it's about factually what happened, not, I'm going to tell you the story. I'm not going to how to tell you how to think about it. That's up to you.
Well, like I said, I actually had the pleasure of being trained by somebody that was the press secretary under LBJ, because I actually went and got my journalism degree from Marquette. And while I was there, one of my professors was George Reedy, and George Reedy was definitely LBJ's press secretary. So I do know about that Texas environment. And also being here in North Carolina, I have always been a big fan of Charles Kuralt and some of those kind of reporters that are, like you said, just the kind that wanted to tell the facts, present the facts, and all along those lines. So even here on Pod TV, that's the style of reporting that I like to do and everything. And sometimes there is conflicts because people think that I'm saying one thing, but I absolutely, like I said, I'd like to hear people's different views. Like I said, I've heard you say some different views today, some of them that I might agree with, some that I might not agree with. But if anybody watch this interview would never know that, because that's not something that I think is effective journalism. I think that it's to let people share their story and get their message across, whether we agree or disagree, and all along those lines.
Well, in my podcast, truecrimereporter.com, and we're on all the podcast channels, we're not really breaking news. We're telling stories about cases, people have retired. We're really just trying to tell good stories. However, I've been working on a story today for next week that is about the contraband that's being smuggled into prisons. It's epidemic across the country, especially the cell phones. And so I've been working on this off and on for quite a while. And so it's a really interesting story that I can tell well, and it'll hook the true crime listener, but it's about a problem that exists today. So some of my stories are, old and from the past, are just interesting. But we try to do something that educates. We really try to come up with episodes here and there that educate people. I do feel that a lot of the true crime podcasts are exploitive. I want to say to some of the major ones, the big ones, hey, like names like True Crime and Wine and stuff like that. I want to say, do you know somebody died here? Right. Do you know the grief and suffering that their families, it goes on all their life. I've been with these people. There's no closure. There's no closure. Mm-hmm. So, we're trying to do it different. I want to make sure, I'm just not, a lot of your podcasts today plagiarize. They're copying what authors have done and what journalists have done. And that's just not right. No, I believe in original reporting. And that's where I'm going with it. I'm about to I'm working on possibly starting another podcast. And what I have found is that the press has been so cut back. Courthouses are rarely covered anymore. The lawsuits in courthouses are not covered. I was at a meeting, and the chief judge of the Northern District, the Federal District of Texas, called me out and said, "Where are you people? I've got major drug cases here. I've got intellectual property cases. I've got incredible crime cases. Where are you?" Wow. Nobody comes around anymore. Well, there's not many people anymore, and many news organizations have decided, our listeners or our viewers, our readers, they're not interested in that. So one of the areas I've seen neglected are all the personal injury lawsuits being filed. These might be for defective vehicles, right, defective appliances, dangerous architecture, that whole realm of somebody has been injured. So it's not getting covered. I've decided I'm going to start covering I'm going to put those lawsuits out. I'm calling it Truth in Tragedy.
Oh, wow. I like that title, Truth in Tragedy. And there's a lot
Truth
of that.
in Tragedy. So, I'm come across a case here where at an apartment complex, the boiler room was not maintained. My opinion, these are slumlords, and CO2 leaked into the apartment near the boiler room, and others, and 2 young children are forever have brain damage.
Yeah, we just saw something like that here in North Carolina because there is a project area, and it was definitely one of those areas that was considered a project. But where they have demolished that area, they found it had a tremendous amount of asbestos and all along those areas. So that has been an issue here in North Carolina. And I don't know if you ever covered these 2 true crimes, but we had 2 famous cases, one that involved the Duke students and the Duke lacrosse case, and all along those lines. And a lot of people remember Mike Peterson and his famous back defense, and all along those lines. I was actually at that party that they were at before the killing took place, because I remember literally turning on the news and hearing about the murder. He was on the board of the Arts Council at the time that I think I was working there. So literally it was the Independent, which was one of those magazines you're talking about, because there used to be these small magazines that did a lot of kind of reporting, but then they got bought out by different people, so they don't do as much investigative reporting as even they used to do. But they were the ones that actually threw that party that was here in the area. And the Independent still exists, but it doesn't do as much investigative reporting. They still do some, but they don't do as much as I felt that they did in the past.
So you're in North Carolina?
I'm in North Carolina, in the Durham area. Literally, I can almost throw a rock at Duke.
My son's been a patient at Duke in their brain tumor center.
Okay.
Best in the world. Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing place. Also, you've got a terrific investigator there that was a special agent for NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. He started the first federal cold case unit there. Retired, but still has a nonprofit that works out of North Carolina. I'll send you the name of the nonprofit. But they will go out and help small departments try to solve complex cases that they don't have the resources for. And he's one of maybe the smartest cold case investigator in the United States. He's amazing. Amazing. Very, very bright. And I've had a lot of contact with him and stuff. It's somebody, you're there in North Carolina. You need to have him on.
I would definitely love to have him on, have conversations with him like I've been having with you and everything. You talked about the defective equipment and everything along those lines. Actually, a friend of mine, I think I mentioned it earlier today, that one of the places I work is a cultural arts center. It's an African-American cultural arts center, but we have a couple of tenants downstairs. There's a manicurist. There is a guy that sells African clothes, but there's also a sheriff, and I think he's doing some side businesses, but one of his side businesses, when he's not doing his deputy sheriff work, is everything is literally what you just said. He and some business partners, they were doing some stuff, I think with real-time aspirin or one of those, but now they are also selling appliances to some of those apartment complexes that you were talking about. So they've actually made an entire business about going and refitting and getting these things fixed and then supplying them to apartments, to houses, and all along those lines. So that's actually a business that Mr. Michael LeMay is going into, as he is almost at the end of his career, because he's almost at retirement years and all in that space. Yeah. But it's been interesting to see him.
So this agent recently brought to my attention a case that he's heard about called the Phoenix lynching. Have you heard of this?
I've not heard of the Phoenix lynching.
It's a South Carolina case. It happened in the late 1800s. And the whites discovered that a group of African-American men were going to vote in the Republican primary and pull them out of their houses in the middle of the night and hung all of them and buried them in an unmarked grave. And my understanding is only recently in that county have they even acknowledged this happened. And we hear there's a relative that would like to, find the bodies. And so we may be doing something together on that. I'm going to try to do a podcast on it. Unfortunately, I'm doing these TV stuff, but we're living in a time when they were like, they would never take that on because they're going to look at me and say, well, Robert, what if they don't find the bodies? And I'm like, do you know how good this story is of what we can learn from history here, what's happened? This is like what happened in Tulsa. It's like what happened to the Osage Indians in Oklahoma that the movie's coming out about. But, you know, Hollywood gets locked into one theme or something, you know, it's hard to, but this is what I love about a podcast. We can do it on a podcast. You know, I don't have to answer to some Hollywood executive or anything. It's us.
Yeah, I agree with you, and definitely there have been some great stories that have even been told about one of the other Black Wall Streets, because Durham had a major Black Wall Street that was a very thriving community, very similar to Tulsa. I think in Tulsa it was the bombing or things along those lines that they say destroyed that community. It was literally the highway, and I'm not knocking the highway because the highway is something that people have to use to get from point A to point B, but it was definitely intentionally done in the sense of destroying that neighborhood and part of the urban renewal. So that was part of the conversation. And there've been a couple of documentaries made about it, but nothing that has been Hollywood made because, like you said, it's not fitting the narrative of what they would like and everything. But Robert, this has been a great conversation. I hope that you'll come back on in other times, both for the World Politics and World Edition. I think both Sasha and Nick, who's still in the background and everything, have enjoyed your conversation. And Nick and Kim, who is the blonde lady that you saw earlier, are the two founders of this particular podcasting network. And they founded it during the pandemic, as I told you when I sent you the email and everything. But definitely they are trying to bring in people of different viewpoints and all along those lines. So I usually, after I give people the emails, I send them the invitation. So I'll probably add your name to it. And whenever you're able to, you're very busy with your podcast, jump on whenever you can.
And if you hear of a great crime story from the past or present, or your listeners, just email me at fan@truecrimereporter.com, fan@truecrimereporter.com. That's where all that comes in. Unfortunately, a lot of people ask us if we can come solve the case, and we just don't have the resources for it. But you never know. You never know. Some of these things, you know, I've had some inmates contact me, and that, you know, I think maybe they are innocent. They're so earnest. It's hard to turn back that conviction, but at least I can do a story about it.
No doubt about that. And you mentioned investigative journalism. One of the panelists that we used to have regularly, and then he had a death in his own family that it caused him not to be on as much, but apparently I'm supposed to be sending him the invitation, and hopefully he'll be joining as well. But David K. Johnson, who is there in California, has been on the show, and he is definitely an investigative reporter as well. So you heard, I think it was Kim or Nick mentioned David Walker, who was the Comptroller General, but David K. Johnson, who is an investigative reporter, has been on the show. And we also have an immense gentleman, which is Rick Rosner, that has come on the show, and he was actually the gentleman that actually challenged one of the game shows. And even though he didn't win that case, he challenged it because he was thinking that one of the things that they put out as a fact wasn't necessarily a fact. So he definitely challenged them, and he's one of our regulars as well. So definitely I'll be sending you invitations, but I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.
Enjoyed it.
I hope you are able to come back in the not too distant future.
Sure.
To go
Anytime.
30 seconds. Bye.
Mark, have a nice evening and week. Thank you.
You do the same.